What drives people to call a queen the Mad? How does a woman get crowned? King. Why would the ruler of a powerful empire be remembered simply as the grandmother of Europe? Behind every royal nickname, there is a story. Sometimes it is a tale of love and diplomacy. Other times it is a story of tragedy, political maneuvering, and a reputation, fair or not, that echoes through centuries. These names were given by enemies, by subjects, by family, or even by the queens themselves. And they reveal more than any formal title ever could. Number 19, was she China's most ruthless ruler? Wu Zetian was the only woman to ever rule China in her own right. She founded her own dynasty, the Zhou, interrupting the Tang dynasty for 15 years. Her path to power was long. She entered the palace as a junior concubine to Emperor Taizong when she was just 14. Wu Zetian was born in 624. Her family was wealthy and semi-aristocratic. Her father was a chancellor in the early Tang dynasty. This gave her an education that most women of her time could only dream of. She learned to read, write, and understand politics. When she entered the Forbidden City, she was not just another pretty face. She was intelligent and ambitious. But as a low-ranking concubine of Emperor Taizong, her prospects were limited. He gave her the name Mei Niang, meaning beautiful girl. He was more interested in her looks than her mind. She spent 12 years in this role, learning the complex rules of court life. She watched, she learned. And she waited. When Emperor Taizong died in 649, his son Li Ji became Emperor Gaozong. According to custom, all of the old emperor's childless concubines had their heads shaved and were sent to a Buddhist monastery to live out their days. Wu Zetian was one of them. It should have been the end of her story, but it was not. During her time in the palace, she had formed a relationship with the new emperor Gaozong. He was captivated by her. He visited her at the monastery. Soon he brought her back to the palace. This was a major scandal. She was, in a sense, his stepmother. But Emperor Gaozong was deeply in love. He also saw her political skill as an asset. His current empress, Empress Wang, and his favorite consort, Consort Zhao, were locked in a power struggle. They saw Wu Zetian as a minor distraction. They even encouraged the emperor to spend time with her, hoping to divert his attention from the other. This was a fatal miscalculation. Wu Zetian quickly outmaneuvered them both. She was skilled at court intrigue. She knew how to build alliances and how to isolate her enemies. Within a few years, she had become the emperor's favorite. She gave birth to his sons, solidifying her position. Then, in 654, her infant daughter died. The story that has been passed down for centuries is a dark one. It is said that Wu Zetian herself ended the child's life and blamed Empress Wang. There is no definitive proof of this. It could have been a tragic case of crib death, or it could have been a story invented later by her enemies to tarnish her name. Whatever the truth, the outcome was the same. Emperor Gaozong believed the story. He deposed Empress Wang and Consort Zhao. In 655, he made Wu Zetian his new empress. From that moment on, her power grew. Emperor Gaozong suffered from poor health, including a stroke that affected his eyesight. He came to rely on Empress Wu for everything. She sat behind a screen during court audiences, listening and advising. Soon she was making decisions herself. They were known as the Two Sages, ruling China together. In reality, she was the one in control. Her nickname, the Iron Lady, is a modern one, but it captures the perception of her rule. She was tough, decisive, and unforgiving. She created a system to maintain her power. She used a network of secret police to identify and eliminate her rivals. Anyone who questioned her authority was dealt with swiftly. She promoted officials based on merit, not just on their family connections. This won her the loyalty of many talented men from lower classes. She also skillfully used Buddhism to support her claim to power. A document was discovered called the Great Cloud Sutra, which prophesied the reincarnation of the Buddha Maitreya as a female monarch. Buddhist scholars wrote commentaries officially declaring that Empress Wu was this monarch. When Emperor Gaozong died in 683, their son Li Xian became Emperor Zhongzong. He was a puppet. His wife, Empress Wei, tried to assert her own family's power. Wu Zetian would not allow it. Within 6 weeks she had him deposed and exiled. She then installed her younger, more pliable son Li Dan as Emperor Ruozong. He was a prisoner in the inner palace and never attended any imperial meetings. Wu Zetian, now the Empress Dowager, ruled openly. For 7 years she ruled through her son. But she wanted more. She was not content to be the power behind the throne. She wanted the throne itself. In 609, at the age of 67, she took the final step. She had Emperor Ruozong abdicate. She proclaimed the founding of a new dynasty, the Zhou. She took the title of Emperor Shengshen, becoming the first and only woman to ever hold that title. She was not an empress consort, she was not a regent, she was the emperor. Her 15-year reign as emperor was a period of stability and prosperity for China. She expanded the empire's borders. She oversaw major infrastructure projects. She promoted trade along the Silk Road. She was a patron of the arts and scholarship, but she never stopped being ruthless. She trusted very few people. The purges of officials and rival families continued. By the early 700s, Wu Zetian was in her late 70s, and her health was failing. Court officials grew worried about the succession. She had made her nephews her heirs, but the powerful ministers wanted the Tang dynasty restored. In 705, while she was ill, they staged a coup. They forced her to abdicate in favor of her exiled son Li Xian, who returned to the throne as Emperor Zhongzong. The Tang dynasty was restored. Wu Zetian was given the honorary title of Empress Regnant Zetian de Sheng. She died later that year. History has not been kind to Wu Zetian. Confucian historians who believed that a woman's place was in the home painted her as a monster. They accused her of terrible crimes and portrayed her as a usurper who broke the natural order of things. Her nickname, the Iron Lady, reflects this view. It speaks of a woman who was hard, unyielding, and who ruled with an iron fist. It captures the fear and awe she inspired, but it misses the complexity of her story. She was a brilliant political strategist who survived and thrived in the cutthroat world of the imperial court. She was a capable ruler who governed a vast empire effectively for decades. She was a woman who shattered every convention of her time to seize the ultimate power. Number 18, could one woman nearly break the Roman Empire? Boudica was not her nickname, it was her name. In the ancient Celtic language of the Britons, it meant victory. She lived up to it. Her rebellion in 60 or 61 AD was so ferocious that it nearly drove the Romans out of Britain. For a brief time, a queen from a small client kingdom made the most powerful empire in the world tremble. Boudica was the wife of Prasutagus, the king of the Iceni. The Iceni were a tribe who lived in what is now Norfolk in eastern England. When the Romans conquered southern Britain in 43 AD, the Iceni were not defeated in battle. Instead, they allied themselves with Rome. They became a client kingdom. This meant they could keep their own rulers and a degree of independence as long as they were loyal to Rome and followed its directives. For years, this arrangement worked. Prasutagus ruled his people, and the Romans left them mostly alone. But Prasutagus was old. He knew that when he died, the Romans might simply absorb his kingdom into their province. He tried to prevent this. In his will, he made the Roman emperor a co-heir to his kingdom, along with his own 2 daughters. He hoped this would satisfy Rome's greed. He hoped they would respect his wishes and allow his family to continue to rule. He was wrong. When Prasutagus died, the Romans, showed their true colors. They ignored the will completely. The local Roman procurator, Titus Decianus, decided to treat the Iceni kingdom as conquered territory. The Roman officials and soldiers moved in. They seized the property of the Iceni nobles. They treated the people like subjects, not allies. When Boudica protested, she was publicly flogged. Her 2 young daughters were assaulted. This was a profound humiliation. It was not just an attack on a royal family, it was an attack on the honor of the entire Iceni tribe. The Romans had misjudged them badly. They thought they could crush their spirit. Instead, they lit a fire. And Boudica, filled with grief and rage, began to rally her people. She was described by the Roman historian Cassius Dio as being tall, with long red hair, a harsh voice, and a piercing glare. She was a charismatic and powerful leader. She spoke to her warriors, reminding them of the injustices they had suffered. She told them it was better to die in freedom than to live as slaves. The Iceni were not alone. Other tribes in the area were also unhappy with Roman rule. The Trinovantes, their neighbors, had seen their capital city turned into a Roman colony, Camulodunum, modern Colchester. A massive temple had been built there, dedicated to the former Emperor Claudius. The Britons were forced to pay for it. This temple was a constant reminder of their subjugation. They eagerly joined Boudica's cause. The timing of the rebellion was perfect. The Roman governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was away on a campaign. He had taken 2 of the 4 legions in Britain with him to attack the island of Mona Anglesey in Wales, a stronghold of the Druids. This left the southeast of Britain dangerously exposed. Boudica's army, which grew to an estimated 100,000 people, struck first at Camulodunum. The town had no defensive walls. The retired Roman soldiers who lived there were not prepared for an attack. The Britons swept through the town, destroying everything. The few Roman defenders retreated to the Temple of Claudius. They held out for 2 days before the rebels broke in and finished them off. The town was burned to the ground. The news reached the Roman Ninth Legion, which marched to relieve the city. Boudica's army ambushed them in the open country and annihilated their infantry. Only the commander and some of his cavalry escaped. The Roman presence in the southeast had been shattered. Catus Decianus, the procurator, whose greed had started the whole thing, fled to Gaul. Next, the rebel army marched on Londinium, London. It was a thriving commercial center, but like Camulodunum, it was not a military fortress. Suetonius Paulinus, hearing of the disaster, raced back from Wales. He reached Londinium before Boudica, but he realized he did not have enough soldiers to defend it. He made the difficult decision to abandon the city to save his army. He told the citizens to flee with him, but many stayed behind. When Boudica's forces arrived, they repeated what they had done at Camulodunum. The town was sacked and burned. Anyone who had not fled was killed. From Londinium, the Britons moved to Verulamium St. Albans, another Roman town. It, too, was destroyed. In the space of a few weeks, the 3 main centers of Roman life in Britain had been wiped off the map. The Roman historian Tacitus estimated that 70,000 Romans and pro-Roman Britons had been killed. Boudica, whose name meant victory, had been victorious beyond anyone's imagination. But Suetonius Paulinus was a skilled general. He had gathered what forces he could, a force of about 10,000 men. He knew he could not let the rebels run rampant forever. He chose his ground carefully for the final battle. He picked a spot with a narrow gorge, with a forest behind him. This meant the Britons could not use their superior numbers to surround him. Boudica's army was confident. They had brought their families with them in wagons, which they parked at the edge of the battlefield to watch the final triumph. Boudica rode through her forces in a chariot with her daughters, urging them on to one last victory. The battle began. The Britons charged forward in a massive wave, but the narrow field funneled them together. The disciplined Roman legionaries held their ground. They threw their javelins into the charging mass, then drew their short swords and advanced in a tight wedge formation. The Britons were a brave but disorganized force. They were no match for the professional Roman army in a pitched battle. The Romans pushed forward, and the Britons broke and fled. Their escape was blocked by their own wagons. The Roman soldiers showed no mercy. They killed not just the warriors, but the women and children as well. Boudica's rebellion was over. Tacitus says that she took poison rather than be captured. The Romans spent the next few months brutally punishing the rebellious tribes. But they had learned a lesson. They replaced Suetonius Paulinus with a more conciliatory governor. They realized they had to rule Britain more justly if they wanted to avoid another such uprising. Boudica was defeated, but she was never forgotten. Her name, Victory, became a title for her defiance. She was a queen who refused to be humiliated, who rose up against the most powerful empire in the world, and for a short, brilliant moment, almost won. Number 17, was she a king? Not a queen. Jadwiga of Poland was crowned in 1384. She was just 10 years old, but the title she was given was not Regina, meaning queen. It was Rex, meaning king. This was not a mistake. It was a deliberate political statement. In the eyes of the Polish nobles, Jadwiga was not just the wife of a king. She was the ruler in her own right. Jadwiga was born in 1374, the youngest daughter of Louis the Great, the King of Hungary and Poland. Louis had no sons. This created a major succession problem. In the 14th century, the idea of a woman ruling alone was still controversial. Louis spent years trying to secure the throne for one of his daughters. He made the Polish nobles swear an oath of loyalty to them. After his death in 1382, his eldest daughter, Maria, was supposed to take the Polish throne, but the Polish nobles rejected her. They did not want to continue a personal union with Hungary, and they certainly did not want her husband, Sigismund of Luxembourg, ruling them. So they turned to the younger daughter, Jadwiga. She was living in the Hungarian court. The Polish nobles demanded that she come to Poland to be their monarch. After 2 years of negotiations and political maneuvering, her mother finally agreed. The young girl traveled to Krakow, the capital of Poland. On October 16, 1384, she was crowned in Wawel Cathedral. The decision to crown her as Rex was crucial. It meant that her power came directly from God and the law, not from a husband. It established her as a sovereign ruler, equal to any male king in Europe. But being a 10-year-old king came with its own problems. The most pressing was marriage. Jadwiga was already betrothed. Since she was a child, she had been promised to William of Habsburg, an Austrian prince. According to some accounts, they were deeply in love. But the Polish nobles had other plans. They saw a brilliant strategic opportunity. To their east was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It was a vast, powerful, and still largely pagan state. The Poles had been in conflict with the Lithuanians for years. The nobles proposed a radical solution, a marriage between Jadwiga and Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. This marriage would create a powerful Polish-Lithuanian union. It would end the conflict between the two states. And, most importantly for the deeply Catholic Poles, it would mean the conversion of Lithuania, the last pagan state in Europe, to Christianity. It was a political masterstroke. There was just one problem, Jadwiga. She was a devout young girl, and she considered her betrothal to William to be a sacred promise. She did not want to marry Jogaila. He was a man in his 30s, a pagan from a land she considered wild and uncivilized. There were rumors that he was monstrous and covered in hair. William of Habsburg even came to Krakow to try to consummate his marriage to Jadwiga and claim his rights. The situation was tense. The nobles had to physically bar him from the castle. According to one famous story, Jadwiga even took an axe and tried to chop down the gate of Wawel Castle to escape and join him. The nobles reasoned with her. They explained the immense good that would come from the marriage. They told her it was her duty to her people and to her faith. The conversion of an entire nation rested on her decision. It was a heavy burden for a 12-year-old. After much prayer and soul-searching, Jadwiga agreed. She put her duty above her personal happiness. In 1386, Jogaila arrived in Krakow. He was baptized, taking the Christian name Ladislaw. A few days later, he and Jadwiga were married. He was then crowned King of Poland. He ruled alongside Jadwiga. It was a joint rule, but everyone knew that Jadwiga's legitimacy was the foundation of his power in Poland. Despite the difficult start, the marriage seems to have become a respectful partnership. Jadwiga was not a passive queen consort. She was an active ruler. She was highly intelligent and well-educated, speaking at least 5 languages. She was involved in political, diplomatic, and cultural life. She led diplomatic missions. She even led a military campaign to reclaim lands in the East. She was also known for her deep piety and charity. She founded hospitals and churches. She sponsored religious art and music. One of her most significant achievements was the restoration of the Krakow Academy. She sold her own royal jewelry to fund the college, which was later renamed Jagiellonian University in honor of her and her husband's dynasty. It became one of the great centers of learning in Europe. Jadwiga's life was short. In 1399, at the age of 25, she gave birth to her first child, a daughter. But there were complications. The baby died after 3 weeks. Jadwiga died 4 days later from an infection. Her death was a cause for national mourning. She had ruled for 15 years and had become beloved by her people. Her decision to sacrifice her personal happiness for the good of her country had a profound impact on European history. The Polish-Lithuanian Union that she helped create lasted for over 400 years. It was one of the largest and most powerful states in Europe. Lithuania became a Christian nation, changing the religious and political map of the continent. Jadwiga was never given a catchy nickname like the Great or the Wise. Her title, King, was her nickname. It was a name that defined her unique position. It declared that she was a ruler in her own right, whose power was not dependent on any man. She was venerated as a saint for centuries in Poland, and in 1997, the Catholic Church officially canonized her. She is remembered not just as a queen, but as King Jadwiga, the young ruler who made a difficult choice and shaped the future of a nation. Number 16, why was a British queen called Brandy Nan? Queen Anne ruled Great Britain from 1702 to 1714. Her reign was short but incredibly significant. It saw the formal union of England and Scotland into a single kingdom, Great Britain. The country became a major player in European politics thanks to the military victories of the Duke of Marlborough in the War of the Spanish Succession. It was a time of great cultural flourishing, with figures like Isaac Newton, Jonathan Swift, and Daniel Defoe. Yet, the Queen herself is often remembered by a rather unflattering nickname, Brandy Nan. The name suggests a monarch who was constantly drunk. It was a nickname pushed by her political enemies, particularly the Whigs, who fell out of favor with her later in her reign. They wanted to portray her as a weak, easily manipulated ruler who drowned her sorrows in alcohol. The truth is much more complex and tragic. Anne's life was filled with chronic illness and personal loss. She suffered from gout for most of her adult life. It was a painful condition that caused her joints to swell. In her later years, it became so severe that she had to be carried around in a sedan chair. She was also morbidly obese, which made her health problems worse. She endured at least 17 pregnancies. Most ended in miscarriages or stillbirths. Of the 5 children who were born alive, 4 died in infancy. Her only surviving son, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, died in 1700 at the age of 11. His death was a devastating personal blow and a national crisis. It left the Protestant Stuart line with no direct heir, paving the way for the Hanoverian succession after Anne's death. Given this constant physical pain and emotional grief, it is not surprising that Anne might have sought comfort. In the 18th century, brandy was often used for medicinal purposes. It was seen as restorative and a pain reliever. It is very likely that Anne did drink brandy for her gout and other ailments, but the idea that she was a drunkard who neglected her duties is a political smear. Anne was, in fact, a hard-working and conscientious monarch. She attended cabinet meetings more regularly than many of her predecessors. She took a keen interest in matters of state, especially in the affairs of the Church of England, of which she was the devout head. She was the last Stuart monarch, and she had a strong sense of her royal prerogative. She was not easily manipulated. She could be stubborn and determined when she felt strongly about an issue. Her political life was dominated by her relationship with 2 people, Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, and her husband, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. Sarah was Anne's closest friend from childhood. When Anne became queen, she made Sarah her mistress of the robes and keeper of the privy purse. The Duke of Marlborough was made the captain general of the army. For years, this trio effectively ran the country. Sarah was famously domineering and tried to push Anne to support the Whig Party, which was in favor of the war. But over time, the friendship soured. Anne grew tired of Sarah's constant hectoring and political pressure. She found a new, gentler confidante in her lady-in-waiting, Abigail Masham. Abigail was a cousin of Sarah Churchill, but she was aligned with the Tory party, which favored peace. The growing rift between the Queen and the Duchess became a major political battle. In 1710, Anne finally dismissed the Marlboroughs from their posts. She then installed a new Tory government that began peace negotiations to end the long and costly war. This was not the action of a weak, drunken queen. It was the decision of a monarch who was asserting her own political will. It was after this break that the Brandy Nan nickname really took hold, spread by the angry Whigs who had lost their power. The end of her reign was dominated by the succession crisis. The Act of Settlement in 1701 had decreed that the throne would pass to the Protestant House of Hanover in Germany, as Anne had no surviving children. But There were still many who supported the claim of her Catholic half-brother, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender. Anne, herself, had complicated feelings on the matter. She was a staunch Protestant, but the idea of disinheriting her own family was painful. In the end, she stuck to the law. On her deathbed in 1714, she ensured a smooth transfer of power to George I of Hanover. Anne's legacy is significant. The Act of Union in 1707, which she championed, created the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Her reign saw the development of the two-party political system of Whigs and Tories. It was a golden age of literature and architecture, yet she is often overshadowed by other more glamorous monarchs. The nickname Brandy Nan has stuck, reducing a complex and often tragic figure to a simple caricature. It reminds us how political attacks can shape a person's historical reputation, often obscuring the truth of a life lived in constant pain, but also with a profound sense of duty. Number 15, what does it mean to be the grandmother of Europe? Queen Victoria reigned for 63 years, from 1837 to 1901. Her time on the throne is known as the Victorian era, a period of immense industrial, cultural, and scientific change. The British Empire reached its peak, covering a quarter of the globe, but Victoria had another, more personal title, the Grandmother of Europe. This was not a formal title, but it was a fact. Through the marriages of her 9 children, she became the matriarch of a vast royal network that stretched across the entire continent. Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, had a very clear plan. They had 9 children: Victoria, Albert, Edward, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. They wanted to secure the future of their dynasty and promote peace and stability in Europe. They believed that by marrying their children into the other great royal houses, they could create a family bond that would prevent future wars. It was a form of personal dynastic diplomacy. The scale of this family network was staggering. Her eldest daughter, Victoria, married the future German Emperor Frederick III. Their son was Kaiser Wilhelm II, the ruler of Germany during World War I. Victoria's eldest son, Albert Edward, became King Edward VII of the United Kingdom. His wife, Alexandra, was a Danish princess whose sister, Dagmar, married Tsar Alexander III of Russia. This meant that the future King George V of Britain and the future Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were first cousins. In fact, they looked so much alike that they could be mistaken for twins. Another of Victoria's daughters, Alice, married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse in Germany. One of their daughters was Alix, who would marry Tsar Nicholas II and become the infamous Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna of Russia. Another of Alice's daughters, Irene, married her cousin Prince Heinrich of Prussia, the brother of Kaiser Wilhelm II. This meant that the rulers of Britain, Germany, and Russia during World War I were all Victoria's grandchildren or grandchildren-in-law. The web of connections continued. Her son Alfred married the only daughter of Tsar Alexander II of Russia. Her son Arthur's daughter Margaret became the crown princess of Sweden. Her youngest daughter Beatrice had a daughter named Victoria Eugenie, who became the Queen of Spain. Her Victoria's grandchildren and great-grandchildren sat on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, Sweden, Norway, and Spain. Victoria took her role as the family matriarch very seriously. She kept up a massive correspondence with her children and grandchildren all over the continent. She offered advice, both personal and political. She tried to mediate disputes between her relatives. She was, in many ways, the central hub of European royalty. When the family gathered for weddings or jubilees, it was a meeting of the crowned heads of Europe. But the great dream of Prince Albert and Queen Victoria, that this family network would guarantee peace, ultimately failed. Family ties were not strong enough to overcome the powerful forces of nationalism, imperialism, and military ambition that were building up in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The personal relationships between the cousins were often strained. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, for example, had a complicated and often resentful relationship with his British relatives. He felt that they looked down on him and his country. When World War I broke out in 1914, it was a tragic family affair. Victoria's grandchildren were on opposing sides of the conflict. King George V of the United Kingdom was at war with his first cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. And both were at war with the husband of another first cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, at least, until Russia left the war. The war destroyed the very world that Victoria's dynastic politics had tried to preserve. It swept away the German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian empires. It was the end of the Age of Kings. The nickname the Grandmother of Europe is a perfect description of Victoria's unique position in the 19th century. It speaks of her long life, her large family, and her central role in the intertwined world of European royalty. But it is also a poignant reminder of a failed dream. The family that was supposed to unite a continent ended up leading it into its most destructive war. The grandmother's influence was vast, but in the end it could not stop her grandchildren from fighting. Number 14. Could a queen's love life destabilize a kingdom? Juana of Castile was the daughter of two of the most powerful monarchs in history, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, the famous Catholic monarchs of Spain. She was born into a world of immense power and privilege, yet she is remembered by a tragic nickname, Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Her story is a heartbreaking tale of love, obsession, and political betrayal, where it is hard to tell the difference between genuine mental illness and the cruel ambitions of the men around her. When Juana was born in 1479, she was a highly intelligent child, educated in the finest traditions of the Renaissance. She was skilled in music, dance, and languages. In 1496, at the age of 16, she was sent to Flanders, part of the modern-day Netherlands, and Belgium to marry Philip, the Duke of Burgundy. He was known as Philip the Handsome, and he was the heir to the vast Habsburg lands. It was a political match designed to create an alliance against France. But for Juana, it became an all-consuming love affair. From the moment she met Philip, she was utterly infatuated with him. And he, at first, seemed to return her feelings. Their relationship was passionate and intense, but Philip was also a notorious womanizer. His constant infidelities drove Juana into fits of jealousy and despair. There were public scenes and angry confrontations. This was the first evidence of the instability that her enemies would later use against her. Tragedy then struck Juana's family, one event after another. Her only brother, John, died. Then her older sister, Isabella, died. Then Isabella's young son, Miguel, also died. Suddenly, Juana, who had been third in line, was the heir to the crowns of both Castile and Aragon. This changed everything. She was no longer just the wife of a duke. She was the future ruler of a powerful and wealthy kingdom. In 1504, her mother, Queen Isabella, died. In her will, Isabella made Juana the Queen of Castile, but she also included a clause. It said that if Juana was unwilling or unable to rule, her father Ferdinand should act as regent. This was the opening that Ferdinand and Juana's husband Philip were looking for. Juana and Philip traveled to Spain to claim her throne. But the two men in her life, her father and her husband, were now bitter rivals for power. Both of them began to spread rumors that Juana was mentally unstable and unfit to rule. They pointed to her jealous rages and her deep melancholy as proof of her madness. It is impossible to know the full truth of her mental state. She was certainly suffering from what we would now likely call depression, exacerbated by her husband's cruelty and the political pressure she was under. But was she mad, or was it more convenient for the men around her to have her declared so? In 1506, a deal was struck. Ferdinand was pushed aside, and Philip and Juana were recognized as co-rulers of Castile. Philip was effectively the king. He immediately began to isolate Juana, keeping her confined and dismissing her loyal servants. But his triumph was short-lived. Just a few months later, in September 1506, Philip died suddenly, probably from typhoid fever. He was only 28 years old. Juana was consumed by grief. This is the period of her life that truly cemented her nickname. She refused to let Philip's body be buried. For months, she traveled with his coffin across the Castilian countryside from one town to another. She would have the coffin opened so she could look at his face. This macabre procession was seen by many as absolute proof of her insanity. Her father, Ferdinand, saw his chance. He returned to Castile and took control. He declared that his daughter was indeed mad and unfit to rule. In 1509, he had her confined to the royal convent of Santa Clara in the small town of Tordesillas, and there she would stay for the rest of her life. She was a prisoner, she was the rightful queen of Castile, but she held no power. When her father Ferdinand died in 1516, her own son, Charles, came to Spain to claim the throne. He was just a teenager. He visited his mother in Tordesillas, but he did not free her. He needed her legitimacy. He was officially a co-ruler with her. All documents were signed with both their names, but Juana remained locked away. She was a queen in name only for nearly 50 years. She lived in the castle convent, often in terrible conditions. Her guards and caretakers treated her poorly. She was a political pawn, too legitimate to be set aside, but too inconvenient to be allowed to rule. She died in 1555 at the age of 75, having been a prisoner for 46 years. The nickname Juana la Loca has defined her legacy. It presents her as a one-dimensional figure of madness and Gothic tragedy, but the story is more complicated. She was a woman caught between powerful men, a philandering husband, an ambitious father, and a power-hungry son, all of whom benefited from her being seen as mentally incompetent. Her deep love for her husband and her profound grief at his death were twisted and used as weapons against her. She was a queen whose crown was stolen from her, not by an invading army, but by her own family, under the shadow of a cruel and unforgettable nickname. Number 13, was she the wisest queen Britain never knew? When people talk about the Georgian era in Britain, they usually talk about the kings, George III, George II, George III, and George IV. Their wives, the queen's consort, are often forgotten, but one of them, Caroline of Ansbach, the wife of King George II, was a major political and intellectual force in her own right. She was so respected for her intelligence and judgment that she earned the nickname Caroline the Wise. Caroline was born in 1683 in Ansbach, a small German state. She was orphaned at a young age and went to live at the court of Sophie Charlotte, the Queen of Prussia. This was a formative experience. Sophie Charlotte was a brilliant and educated woman, a friend of the philosopher Leibniz. Her court was a center of art, music, and intellectual discussion. Caroline thrived in this environment. She developed a love of learning and a sharp, inquisitive mind that was unusual for a woman of her rank at the time. She was considered a great beauty and had many suitors. One of them was the future Holy Roman Emperor. To marry him, she would have had to convert to Catholicism. She refused. She was a staunch Protestant and would not compromise her faith for a crown. This integrity impressed many people, including the Dowager Electress Sophia of Hanover, who was looking for a wife for her grandson, the future George II of Great Britain. In 1705, Caroline and George were married. It was a political marriage, but it became a genuine partnership. George was a difficult man. He was hot-tempered, arrogant, and had a short attention span, but he adored his wife and respected her intelligence absolutely. He trusted her judgment more than anyone else's. When he became King George II in 1727, Caroline became his most important advisor. Her influence was immense, but she was clever enough to wield it subtly. She knew that as a woman, and a foreign one at that, she could not be seen to be ruling. She had to work through her husband and through the government's chief minister, Sir Robert Walpole, and Caroline and Walpole formed a powerful alliance. They essentially ran the country together for over a decade. The king would often have public arguments with Walpole. He would shout and storm out of meetings, but later Caroline would speak to the king in private. She knew how to manage him. She would pretend to agree with him at first, then gently guide him around to her and Walpole's point of view. She would often present the ideas as his own, allowing him to save face. It was a masterful display of political skill. The famous political wit Lord Hervey wrote that her power was unrivaled, her influence unequaled. When the king was away from Britain, which he often was, visiting his beloved Hanover in Germany, he would officially appoint Caroline as the regent. She was not just a figurehead. She governed the country in his absence, dealing with ministers, signing state papers, and making important decisions. Beyond politics, Caroline was a major cultural and intellectual figure. She maintained her interest in philosophy and science. She corresponded with Leibniz. She was a patron of the composer George Frederick Handel. She took an interest in new medical ideas. In 1721, when there was a smallpox epidemic, she became a champion of inoculation, a controversial new procedure at the time. To prove its safety, she had it tested on prisoners and orphan children. When that was successful, she had 2 of her own daughters inoculated. Her public support for the practice helped to popularize it and save many lives. She also had a famously sharp wit. She was not afraid to speak her mind. She once had a public argument with a bishop about theology. She enjoyed intellectual debate and surrounded herself with some of the brightest minds in the country, including the poet Alexander Pope and the writer Voltaire. But her life was not without sorrow. Her relationship with her eldest son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, was terrible. They despised each other. The open hostility between the Queen and her heir was a constant source of court scandal. Caroline suffered from a hernia for many years, a condition she kept secret. In 1737, it became strangulated. The doctors of the time performed a brutal and unsuccessful surgery. She endured it with incredible bravery. As she lay dying, she urged her distraught husband to remarry. He famously sobbed that he would not, saying, "I will have mistresses." Caroline is said to have replied, "Ah, my God, that need not prevent you." She died on November 20th, 1737. King George II was heartbroken. He never fully recovered from her death. He had lost not only his wife, but also his most trusted advisor. His reign became more difficult and less stable without her guidance. The nickname Caroline the Wise was a testament to the deep respect she commanded from those who knew her. She was one of the most intelligent and politically astute queens in British history. She navigated the complex world of Georgian politics with skill and subtlety, shaping the direction of the country from behind the scenes. She was a queen who proved that influence is not always about the title you hold, but about the wisdom you possess. Number 12. Why would a queen be accused of being from the gutter? Theodora, the Empress of the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, was one of the most powerful women in history. She was the wife of the great Emperor Justinian. She was his co-ruler, his most trusted advisor, and the force behind some of his most important reforms. But before she was an empress, she was an actress. And in the world of 6th century Constantinople, actress was a polite term for someone from the lowest rungs of society. Her enemies gave her a nickname that followed her forever: the Empress from the Gutter. The main source for Theodora's early life is The Secret History by the historian Procopius. It is a scandalous and deeply hostile account written by a man who clearly hated both Theodora and Justinian. It is probably filled with exaggeration and outright lies, but even if only a fraction of it is true, Theodora's story is still remarkable. According to Procopius, Theodora was born around the year 500. Her father was a bear-keeper for the Green faction at the Hippodrome, the great chariot racing stadium in Constantinople. The city's social life revolved around the Hippodrome and its 2 main teams, the Blues and the Greens. These were more than just sports teams. They were like political parties with their own social networks and street gangs. When her father died, Theodora's mother was left with 3 young daughters and no income. She quickly remarried. She then brought her daughters onto the stage at the Hippodrome dressed as supplicants to beg the crowd to give her new husband her old husband's job. This was the world Theodora grew up in. The stage of the Hippodrome was not a place for serious drama. It was home to mimes, burlesque, and other entertainments that respectable society considered immoral. Theodora and her sisters became actresses. According to Procopius, Theodora was not a particularly skilled dancer or musician, but she was a gifted comedian and mime. Her performances were famous for being daring and scandalous. She was, by all accounts, incredibly beautiful and charismatic. She lived a life that was a world away from the imperial palace. Sometime in her early 20s, she met Justinian. He was the nephew and heir of the reigning emperor, Justin I. He was a serious, devout, and ambitious man. He was also completely captivated by Theodora. He fell deeply in love with her. He wanted to marry her. There was a huge problem. A Roman law, dating back to the time of Emperor Constantine, forbade a man of senatorial rank from marrying an actress. Justinian was far more than a senator. He was the heir to the throne. The marriage was impossible, but Justinian was persistent. He convinced his uncle, the emperor, to repeal the law. In 525, Justinian and Theodora were married. When Justin I died in 527, they became the emperor and empress of the Byzantine Empire. The snobs and aristocrats of Constantinople were horrified. They looked down on Theodora. They whispered about her past. They called her vulgar and common. They gave her the nickname the Empress from the Gutter to remind everyone of her humble and scandalous origins. But Theodora did not let them intimidate her. She carried herself with all the dignity and authority of a born royal. And she proved to be an exceptional empress. She was not a passive consort. Justinian treated her as his intellectual and political equal. Her name appears alongside his in many of the laws and decrees of the reign. She had her own court, her own officials, and her own agenda. Her courage and clear-headedness were most famously demonstrated during the Nika riots of 532. A riot that started in the Hippodrome between the Blues and the Greens escalated into a full-scale rebellion against Justinian's rule. Large parts of the city were burned, a rival emperor was declared, Justinian's generals and advisors panicked. They urged him to flee the city. They had ships ready at the harbor. It seemed like the reign was over. It was Theodora who saved the throne. She stood up in the council and gave a now famous speech. She declared that she would not flee. She said that she would rather die an empress than live as an exile. She ended with the line, "Royal purple is the noblest shroud." Her speech shamed the men into action. It filled them with new courage. Justinian ordered his loyal generals to attack the rioters who were crowded into the Hippodrome. The rebellion was crushed. Justinian's throne was saved, and it was all thanks to Theodora. After the riots, her influence only grew. She was a champion of the poor and downtrodden. She was particularly focused on the rights of women. She pushed for laws that gave women more rights in divorce, that prohibited forced prostitution, and that gave women property rights. She established a convent for former prostitutes, giving them a safe place to live. It is clear that she never forgot where she came from. She used her immense power to help those who were in the same vulnerable position she had once been in. She was also deeply involved in the complex religious debates of the time. She was a supporter of the Miaphysites, a Christian group that was considered heretical by the official church in Constantinople. She used her influence to protect Miaphysite leaders from persecution. Theodora died in 548, probably from cancer. Justinian was devastated. He ruled for another 17 years, but he never remarried. He continued to speak of her as his honored partner. The nickname the Empress, from the Gutter, was meant as an insult. It was designed to undermine her and remind people that she was not a proper empress. But in a way, it highlights what is most incredible about her story. She rose from the very bottom of society to its absolute pinnacle. She did it through her intelligence, her charm, and her unbreakable will. She proved that a person's origins do not have to define their destiny. She was an actress who became one of the greatest empresses in history. Number 11, could a queen really be mad? Maria I of Portugal was the first undisputed queen regnant of her country. She was a devout and conscientious ruler. During the first part of her reign, Portugal experienced a period of cultural revival. She was initially known as Maria the Pious, but by the end of her life, she was known by a different, much sadder nickname, Maria a Louca, or Maria the Mad. Her life is a tragic story of how personal grief and religious fervor can combine to overwhelm a monarch's mind. Maria was born in 1734. She became queen in 1777 upon the death of her father, King Joseph I. She was the first of her line to rule in her own right. She immediately set about reversing some of the more controversial policies of her father's chief minister, the powerful Marquis of Pombal. Pombal had been a ruthless modernizer who had expelled the Jesuits and curtailed the power of the old nobility. Maria, being deeply religious, was more conservative. She dismissed Pombal and freed many of his political prisoners. Her early reign was generally a peaceful and prosperous time. The problems began in the late 1780s. A series of personal tragedies struck the queen in rapid succession. In 1786, her husband, Peter III, who was also her uncle, died. She was deeply in love with him, and his death was a major blow. Then, in 1788, her eldest son and heir, Joseph, died of smallpox. He was her favorite child, and she had placed all her hopes for the future in him. A few months later, her daughter, Mariana Victoria, also died. To make matters worse, her spiritual confessor, a man she relied on heavily, also passed away. This series of losses plunged Maria into a deep depression. Her natural piety began to curdle into religious mania. She became convinced that she and her family were damned. She would have terrifying religious visions. She would scream for hours that she was destined for hell. She was consumed by guilt and religious terror. Her mental state deteriorated rapidly. She was unable to handle state affairs. In 1792, her surviving son John officially took over the government in her name, though he did not formally become regent until 1799. The queen was kept in seclusion in the royal palace. Her agonizing screams could often be heard by visitors. The political situation in Europe made things even worse. The French Revolution had broken out in 1789. The news of the execution of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette in 1793 horrified the devout and monarchist Maria. It seemed to confirm her fears that the world was being taken over by godless forces. In 1807, the situation became critical. Napoleon's armies invaded Portugal. The entire Portuguese royal family and the court had to make a desperate decision. They decided to flee to their largest and wealthiest colony, Brazil. The entire court, numbering some 15,000 people, boarded a fleet of ships and set sail from Lisbon just as the French army was arriving. The journey across the Atlantic was a nightmare for the mentally fragile queen. She was terrified of the voyage. When they arrived in Brazil in 1808, the court set up a new capital in Rio de Janeiro. It was an unprecedented event, a European kingdom being ruled from one of its colonies. But for Maria, the change of scenery did not help. She remained in her secluded chambers, lost in her own private world of religious terror. She lived for another 8 years in Brazil. She never recovered her sanity. She died in Rio de Janeiro in 1816. By then, Napoleon had been defeated, and her son was ruling as Prince Regent John. He would soon become King John VI of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. The nickname Maria the Mad is a blunt and perhaps unkind summary of her life. Today, she would likely be diagnosed with severe depression or another mental illness brought on by a series of devastating personal losses. In the 18th century, there was little understanding of such conditions. Her suffering was seen simply as madness. Her story is a sad reminder that queens are not immune to human tragedy. The pressures of rule, combined with overwhelming personal grief, were enough to break the mind of a once pious and capable monarch. Number 10 was this queen a saint, or a Shemer. Olga of Kiev ruled the medieval state of Kievan Ruses in the 10th century. She was the wife of Igor of Kiev. When he was killed by a rebellious tribe, she became the regent for their young son, Sviatoslav. What she did next has become the stuff of legend. She took a brutal and cunning revenge on her husband's killers, yet she is also venerated as a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church, known as Saint Olga. How can one person be both a ruthless avenger and a holy saint? The story comes from the primary chronicle, a history of the early Kievan Ruses. In 945, Olga's husband, Igor, went to collect tribute from a tribe called the Drevlians. He was excessively greedy. After collecting the usual amount, he decided to go back and demand more. The Drevlians had had enough. They captured him and killed him. The Drevlians then made a bold proposal. They sent their best men, 20 of them, by boat to Kiev. They proposed that Olga marry their Prince Mal. This would have made the Drevlians the new rulers of Kiev. Olga, a recent widow with a 3-year-old son, appeared weak and vulnerable. They thought she would have no choice but to accept. Olga greeted their ambassadors with a show of great honor. She told them she was pleased with their proposal. She told them to wait in their boat overnight. The next day, she said her people would carry them in their boat to the palace, a great honor. The Drevlians, filled with pride, agreed. The next morning, the people of Kiev carried the boat with the Drevlian ambassadors in it. But they did not carry them to the palace. They carried them to a deep trench that Olga had ordered dug during the night. They then threw the entire boat with the men still in it into the trench and buried them alive. Olga then sent a message to the Drevlians. She said she would accept their proposal, but only if they sent their most distinguished men to escort her to their prince. The Drevlians, unaware of what had happened to their first delegation, proudly sent a party of their best chieftains. When they arrived, Olga invited them to wash up in a bathhouse after their long journey. Once the Drevlians were inside, Olga's men locked the doors and set the building on fire. Her revenge was still not complete. She sent another message to the Drevlians telling them she was on her way. She asked them to prepare a great funeral feast near the city where her husband had been killed, so she could mourn at his grave. The Drevlians, still unsuspecting, prepared a huge quantity of mead for the feast. Olga and her small retinue arrived. She wept at Igor's grave and then joined the feast. She encouraged the Drevlians to drink. When they were drunk and unarmed, she gave a signal to her soldiers. They fell upon the Drevlians and, according to the chronicle, killed 5,000 of them. The final act was a siege. Olga's army besieged the main Drevlian city of Iskorostan for a year. They could not take it, so Olga resorted to cunning again. She sent a message to the city saying she had had enough revenge. She asked only for a small tribute, 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house. The starving Drevlians were overjoyed at such a light tribute and quickly sent the birds. Olga then ordered her soldiers to attach a piece of sulfur bound with cloth to each bird's leg. At nightfall, they lit the cloths and released the birds. The birds flew back to their nests in the houses and barns of the city. The entire city went up in flames. As the people fled the burning city, Olga's soldiers captured them. Some were killed and others were taken as slaves. The Drevlian tribe was crushed. This story of brutal, calculated revenge seems a strange beginning for a saint. But for the people of Kievan Ruses, Olga was a hero. She had defended her son's throne. She had secured the unity of the kingdom. She had shown that the rulers of Kiev were not to be trifled with. After her revenge was complete, Olga's rule was marked by peace and administrative reform. She established a system of tribute collection that was fair and orderly to prevent the kind of dispute that had led to her husband's death. She traveled throughout her lands, setting up trade posts and hunting reserves. The most important event of her later life was her conversion to Christianity. Around the year 957, she traveled to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. There she was baptized by the Patriarch, with the emperor himself as her godfather. She took the Christian name of Helena. She returned to Kiev and tried to convert her son Sviatoslav. He refused. He was a warrior, and he feared his soldiers would mock him if he adopted the new faith. But Olga's conversion was a turning point. Although Christianity did not become the state religion until the reign of her grandson, Vladimir the Great, she was the one who planted the seed. She built the first Christian church in Kiev. When she died in 969, she was buried as a Christian. For her role in bringing Christianity to the land, she was later canonized. She was given the title Apostolos, meaning equal to the apostles. She is venerated as Saint Olga. So, was she a vengeful ruler or a holy saint? In the context of her time, she was both. Her early actions were those of a ruthless pagan warlord, defending her family and her people in the only way she knew how. Her later life was that of a devout Christian monarch laying the groundwork for the future of her nation's faith. Her story reflects the transition of her entire society from a violent pagan past to a new Christian future. Number 9, what if the Virgin Queen was a political masterstroke? And Elizabeth I of England is one of the most famous monarchs in history. She ruled for 44 years, a period known as the Elizabethan Age. It was a time of great exploration, cultural achievement, and national pride. She is known by many names: Gloriana, Good Queen Bess. But the most famous is the Virgin Queen. For her entire reign, Elizabeth never married. This was a constant source of anxiety and political debate. But her decision to remain single was not a romantic failure, it was a brilliant political strategy. As Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558 at the age of 25, she was the daughter of Henry V and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Her early life was precarious. Her mother was executed when she was just 2 years old. Her father declared her illegitimate. She lived through the turbulent reigns of her half-brother Edward VI and her half-sister Mary. She was even imprisoned in the Tower of London for a time, suspected of treason. By the time she became queen, she had learned to be cautious, clever, and to trust her own judgment above all others. From the moment she took the throne, the question of her marriage was the most important issue in politics. Everyone assumed she would marry. A queen was expected to marry to produce an heir and to have a man to help her rule. Her council, her parliament, and the people of England all pressured her to choose a husband, and she had no shortage of suitors. There was Philip II of Spain, her former brother-in-law. There was Archduke Charles of Austria. There were the French princes, the Duke of Anjou and the Duke of Alencon. There was Eric XIV of Sweden. There were also domestic candidates, most notably her childhood friend and favorite, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. And Elizabeth played the diplomatic game with masterful skill. For years, she used the prospect of her hand in marriage as a tool in foreign policy. She would enter into marriage negotiations with one country to gain an advantage over another. She would signal interest in a suitor to keep his country as an ally, and then find a reason to break it off when it was no longer useful. She kept all of Europe guessing for over 2 decades. This marriage game allowed England, a relatively weak country at the time, to navigate the dangerous waters of European politics without being drawn into costly wars or alliances. But why did she never actually marry? There were many reasons. If she married a foreigner, like Philip of Spain, there was a fear that England would become a pawn of another country. Her sister Mary's marriage to Philip had been deeply unpopular. If she married an Englishman, like Robert Dudley, it would create massive jealousy and factionalism at her court. The other nobles would never accept one of their own being elevated above them. There were also personal reasons. Her own father's disastrous marital history was a powerful warning. She had seen what happened to his wives. She valued her own authority. Marriage would mean sharing that authority with a husband. In the 16th century, a husband was expected to be the head of the household, and that included the kingdom. Elizabeth was not willing to give up her power. She once famously told Parliament, "I will have but one mistress here and no master." So she created a new persona for herself. She turned her unmarried status from a weakness into a strength. She presented herself as being married to her kingdom and her people. She was the Virgin Queen, a figure like the Virgin Mary, who was devoted to her subjects. This created a powerful cult of personality. Poets and playwrights celebrated her. She became a symbol of national identity. Her image was one of strength, purity, and devotion to England. Her relationship with Robert Dudley was the one time she seems to have seriously considered marrying for love. But his wife, Amy Robsart, died under suspicious circumstances, falling down a flight of stairs. Although Dudley was cleared of any wrongdoing, the scandal made it politically impossible for Elizabeth to marry him. As she grew older, the pressure to marry and produce an heir lessened. It became clear that she would be the last of the Tudor dynasty. The succession was settled on her cousin, James VI of Scotland, the son of her old rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. When she died in 1603, she had ruled successfully for over 4 decades. She had defeated the Spanish Armada, a moment of great national triumph. She had overseen a golden age of English culture, and she had done it all on her own terms. The nickname the Virgin Queen became her legend. It was not a description of a lonely spinster, it was the title of a queen who was a brilliant politician. She understood that, in her position, the power to say maybe was more valuable than the power to say yes. By remaining single, she kept her options open, kept her rivals off balance, and most importantly, kept her power for herself. She ruled not as a wife or a mother, but as a queen, and a queen alone. Number 8. How did a German princess become the Great? Queen Catherine II of Russia, known as Catherine the Great, was not Russian by birth. She was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, a princess from a minor German state. She came to Russia at the age of 15 to marry the heir to the throne, the Grand Duke Peter. She was a foreigner in a strange and often brutal court. Yet, she would go on to rule Russia for 34 years, expanding its empire and overseeing a flourishing of arts and sciences. How did this German princess manage to not only survive, but become one of the most celebrated rulers in Russian history? Her marriage was a disaster. Her husband Peter was immature, foolish, and possibly impotent. He preferred playing with his toy soldiers to spending time with his intelligent and ambitious wife. And Catherine was neglected and unhappy, but she did not despair. She used her time wisely. She threw herself into learning the Russian language, which she mastered. She converted to the Russian Orthodox faith, showing a deep devotion that impressed the people. She read voraciously, absorbing the works of the French Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot. She was preparing herself to rule. She knew her husband was unpopular. He was obsessed with his native Prussia and openly despised Russia. When he became Tsar Peter III in 1762, his actions quickly alienated the most powerful groups in the country, the army, and the church. He made peace with Prussia, Russia's enemy in the 7 Years' War, giving up all of Russia's hard-won gains. He tried to force the army to adopt Prussian-style uniforms and drills. He threatened to seize church lands. Catherine, meanwhile, had been cultivating her own allies. She had the support of the powerful Orlov brothers, one of whom, Grigory, was her lover. She was popular with the elite Guards regiments. She saw her opportunity. Just 6 months into her husband's reign, she and her supporters staged a coup. On a June morning in 1762, Catherine went to the barracks of the Ismailovsky Guards, who immediately swore allegiance to her. Other regiments quickly followed. She was proclaimed the sole ruler of Russia. Peter III, who was away at one of his palaces, was arrested. A few days later, he was dead, killed under mysterious circumstances, probably by the Orlov brothers. Catherine claimed he had died of colic. At the age of 33, the German princess had become Catherine II, Empress of all Russia. Her reign is often considered a golden age. She saw herself as an enlightened despot. She corresponded with Voltaire. She bought Diderot's library when he was in financial trouble and paid him a salary to be her librarian. She founded schools and academies. She was a great patron of the arts. The Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg began as her personal art collection. She also tried to reform Russia's legal system. She convened a legislative commission with representatives from all classes of society except the serfs to create a new legal code. She wrote a document called the Nakaz, or instruction to guide them, filled with the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment. The commission ultimately failed to produce a new code, but it was a remarkable effort for its time. Her greatest successes were in foreign policy. Under her rule, the Russian Empire expanded dramatically. She waged 2 successful wars against the Ottoman Empire, gaining vast territories in the south, including the Crimea. This gave Russia access to the Black Sea, a long-held strategic goal. She also oversaw the partitions of Poland, in which Russia, Prussia, and Austria carved up the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, wiping it from the map of Europe. By the end of her reign, Russia was more powerful than ever before. But there was a dark side to her enlightened rule. While she talked about the ideals of liberty and reason, the vast majority of her subjects, the serfs, were living in conditions little better than slavery. In 1773, a massive peasant rebellion led by a Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev swept across Russia. Pugachev claimed he was the dead Tsar Peter III. The rebellion was brutally crushed. The event scared Catherine. She realized that any real reform that threatened the power of the nobility who owned the serfs could lead to chaos. After the Pugachev rebellion, she abandoned any serious thought of emancipation and instead strengthened the power of the nobles over their serfs. The nickname the Great was given to her during her lifetime. It was a recognition of her immense achievements in expanding the empire and raising Russia's status as a major European power. She was a woman of huge appetites for power, for knowledge, for art, and for love. She had a long string of lovers, whom she often promoted to high positions. This led to many scandalous rumors, both during her life and after her death. but the nickname sticks because her reign was transformative. She was a brilliant and ruthless politician who seized a throne that was not hers and held on to it for over 3 decades. She may have been born a German princess, but she became one of Russia's most formidable and successful rulers. Number 7. How can a queen blind her own son for a throne? Irene of Athens was a Byzantine empress who ruled in the late 8th century. She was beautiful, intelligent, and deeply ambitious. She is famous for 2 things: her efforts to restore the veneration of icons in the church, and for the ruthless act she committed to secure her power. She had her own son, the rightful emperor, deposed and blinded. This has given her a complex and often dark reputation, earning her nicknames like Irene the Athenian, but also the condemnation of history. Irene came from a noble family in Athens. In 768, she was brought to Constantinople to marry Leo IV, the heir to the Byzantine throne. It was a political match, but she quickly became a major figure at court. There was one major issue that divided her from her new family icons. For decades, the Byzantine Empire had been torn apart by the iconoclast controversy. The iconoclast emperors, including Irene's father-in-law and her husband, believed that the veneration of religious images icons was a form of idolatry. They ordered all icons to be destroyed. Those who defended the use of icons known as iconophiles were persecuted. Irene, coming from Greece, where icon veneration was still strong, was a secret iconophile. She had to hide her beliefs. When her husband, Leo IV, died in 780, their son, Constantine VI, was only 9 years old. Irene became the regent for her young son. Now she had power. She began to carefully plan the restoration of the icons. She appointed officials who shared her views. In 787, she convened the Second Council of Nicaea. The council formally condemned iconoclasm as a heresy and restored the veneration of icons. It was a major victory for Irene and a defining moment for the Orthodox Church. For this, she is considered a saint by the Church. But as her son Constantine grew older, he wanted to rule in his own right. He began to resent his mother's control. A power struggle developed between mother and son. At first, Constantine gained the upper hand. He had his mother confined to a palace. But Irene was a master of political intrigue. She had many loyal supporters. She plotted her comeback. In 797, she and her co-conspirators made their move. They captured Constantine, and then Irene made a terrible decision. To ensure that her son could never challenge her for the throne again, she ordered him to be blinded. It was a common practice in the Byzantine Empire to neutralize political rivals. A blinded person was considered incapable of ruling. The act was carried out in the Porphyry Chamber, the very room where Constantine had been born. He was then imprisoned in a monastery, where he died a few years later. With her son gone, Irene became the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own right. She did not use the title Empress Augusta, but Emperor Basileus. She was the supreme ruler. Her 5-year reign was difficult. The empire was beset by financial problems and military threats. Her unique position as a female emperor even led to a bizarre diplomatic proposal. In the West, the old Roman Empire had been revived in 800 when the Pope crowned Charlemagne, the King of the Franks, as Holy Roman Emperor. The Byzantines, who saw themselves as the true Roman emperors, were insulted. But for a brief time, there was a proposal to unite the two empires by a marriage between Irene and Charlemagne. The plan never came to fruition. Irene's rule came to an end in 802. The officials at court were unhappy with her financial policies and with the fact that she was a woman. They staged a coup and deposed her. The finance minister Nikephoros was proclaimed emperor. Irene was exiled to the island of Lesbos. She died there a year later. Her nickname, the Athenian, simply refers to her place of origin, but her legacy is deeply divided. In the eyes of the Orthodox Church, she is Saint Irene, the defender of the faith who restored the holy icons. In the eyes of history, she is a usurper, a mother who committed a horrific act against her own child to satisfy her ambition for power. She was a ruler who saved the icons, but at a terrible moral cost. Number 6, could a queen's piety also be a weapon? Isabella I of Castile is one of the most significant rulers in Spanish history. Along with her husband, Ferdinand II of Aragon, she is known as one of the Catholic monarchs. This nickname, granted to them by the Pope, perfectly captures the central theme of her reign, the unification of Spain under a single crown and a single militant Catholic faith. Her piety was genuine and deep, but it was also a powerful political tool that she used to forge a new nation. Isabella was born in 1451. Her path to the throne was not easy. She lived through a period of civil unrest and political instability. In 1474, she claimed the throne of Castile after her half-brother died. Her claim was disputed, leading to a war of succession. And Isabella, still in her early 20s, proved to be a formidable leader. She was actively involved in the military campaign, even appearing on the battlefield to rally her troops. By 1479, she had secured her throne. In that same year, her husband Ferdinand became King of Aragon. Their marriage united the two largest kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula, laying the foundation for modern Spain. From the beginning, their rule was defined by their religious goals. The most immediate goal was the completion of the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort by the Christian kingdoms to reclaim the territory that had been under Muslim rule since the 8th century. The last remaining Muslim state was the Emirate of Granada in the south. In 1482, Isabella and Ferdinand launched the final war against Granada. It was a long and difficult 10-year campaign. Isabella was the driving force behind the war effort. She was a brilliant organizer and fundraiser. She saw the war not just as a political conquest, but as a holy crusade. On January 2nd, 1492, the forces of Castile and Aragon finally entered the city of Granada. The Reconquista was complete. It was a moment of immense triumph for Isabella. But the year 1492 held two other events that would define her reign. The first was her sponsorship of the voyage of Christopher Columbus. After being rejected by other European monarchs, Columbus finally convinced Isabella to fund his risky plan to sail west to reach the East Indies. Her decision to back him, driven by a desire to spread Christianity and gain a commercial advantage over Portugal, would change the world. It opened the way for the Spanish colonization of the Americas and the creation of a vast and wealthy empire. The third major event of 1492 was much darker. A few months after the fall of Granada, Isabella and Ferdinand signed the Alhambra Decree. This ordered the expulsion of all practicing Jews from their kingdoms. Jews were given a choice: convert to Catholicism or leave. It is estimated that tens of thousands of people were forced to abandon their homes and possessions and go into exile. This was a brutal act of religious intolerance motivated by a desire to create a purely Catholic Spain. This desire for religious uniformity was also the driving force behind the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478. The Inquisition was a church court designed to root out heresy. Its main targets were conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing their old faith. The Inquisition became a powerful and feared institution, known for its secret procedures and harsh methods. Isabella's nickname, the Catholic, was given to her and Ferdinand by Pope Alexander VI in 1494. It was a recognition of their work in completing the Reconquista, expelling the Jews, and sponsoring Columbus's voyages, which were seen as a way to spread the faith to new lands. For Isabella, her faith and her role as queen were inseparable. She believed she was God's instrument, chosen to purify Spain and spread Catholicism across the world. Her legacy is therefore complex and controversial. She was a strong, effective, and visionary ruler. She unified a fractured country, laid the groundwork for a global empire, and was a great patron of art and learning. But she was also a religious fanatic who used her power to persecute those who did not share her faith. Her piety led to both great achievements and great suffering. The nickname the Catholic captures this duality perfectly. It was the title she would have cherished most, but it also represents the most intolerant and destructive aspects of her reign. Number 5. How did an eagle end up in two nests? Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages. She was, in her long life, the Queen of France and then the Queen of England. She was the wife of two kings and the mother of two kings. She was beautiful, intelligent, wealthy, and fiercely independent. One of the emblems associated with her and her family was the eagle, a symbol of power and nobility. A 12th century writer, in a letter to her, referred to her as an eagle of the broken covenant, a reference to her first failed marriage. The nickname the Eagle captures her soaring ambition and her sharp, predatory political instincts. Eleanor was born around 1122. Her father was the Duke of Aquitaine, a vast and cultured territory in what is now southwestern France. When he died, Eleanor, just 15 years old, inherited the entire duchy. She was now the most eligible heiress in Europe. Her lands were larger and richer than those of the King of France himself. Within weeks, she was married to the heir to the French throne, Louis. Shortly after their marriage, the old king died, and Eleanor became Queen of France. The marriage was not a good match. And Louis II was a pious, monkish man. Eleanor was high-spirited, worldly, and used to the vibrant, poetic court of Aquitaine. They were fundamentally incompatible. The biggest issue was her failure to produce a male heir. They had two daughters. In 1147, Eleanor insisted on accompanying her husband on the Second Crusade. This was highly unusual for a queen. She traveled to the Holy Land with her own contingent of vassals from Aquitaine. The crusade was a military disaster. During their time in the East, rumors swirled about Eleanor. She was accused of having an affair with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch. The relationship between Eleanor and Louis broke down completely. In 1152, after 15 years of marriage, they had their marriage annulled. The official reason was that they were too closely related. Eleanor was now 30 years old and single again. But she was also still the Duchess of Aquitaine. As she traveled back to her own lands, she was so desirable that two different lords tried to kidnap her and force her into marriage to get their hands on her duchy. She evaded them. Just 2 months after her annulment from the King of France, she made her own choice. She married Henry of Anjou. This marriage was a political earthquake. Henry was 11 years younger than her. He was the Duke of Normandy and the Count of Anjou. And most importantly, he was the leading claimant to the throne of England. In 1154, he became King Henry II of England. Eleanor, the former Queen of France, was now the Queen of England. Her lands in France, combined with Henry's, created the vast Angevin Empire, which stretched from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees. The King of France now controlled less territory in France than his own vassal, the King of England. The early years of her marriage to Henry were a success. They were a passionate and energetic couple. They had 8 children together, including 5 sons. 2 of those sons would become kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. But Henry II was a restless and unfaithful husband. Eleanor's role in England was limited. She was a powerful figure, but Henry was the one who ruled. As their sons grew up, the family became deeply dysfunctional. Henry refused to delegate any real power to them. The sons, encouraged by their mother, became resentful. In 1173, Eleanor and her 3 eldest sons launched a great revolt against Henry II. It was an open war within the family. Henry eventually defeated the rebellion. He forgave his sons, but he did not forgive his wife. He had Eleanor captured and imprisoned. For the next 16 years, Eleanor was Henry's prisoner, moved from one castle to another in England. It must have been a terrible time for such a dynamic and powerful woman. Her chance for freedom came in 1189 when Henry II died. Her favorite son, Richard, became king. One of his first acts was to free his mother. Eleanor was now in her late 60s, but her political career was far from over. Richard the Lionheart spent most of his reign outside of England, first on the Third Crusade, and then as a prisoner in Germany. During his long absences, it was Eleanor who effectively governed England. She was the regent, raising the massive ransom needed to free him and putting down the rebellion of her youngest son, John. When Richard died in 1199, she supported the claim of her son John to the throne. She continued to be a major political player well into her late 70s, traveling across Europe to secure diplomatic alliances. She finally retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud, where she died in 1204 at the age of about 82. It was an astonishingly long life for the 12th century. The nickname the Eagle fits her perfectly. She was a queen who soared above the conventions of her time. She was a ruler in her own right, not just a consort. She changed the political map of Europe through her 2 marriages. She was a crusader, a political prisoner, a regent, and the matriarch of a dynasty of kings. She was a force of nature who never stopped fighting for her power and her family. Number 4, why was a Swedish queen called the Minerva of the North? Christina of Sweden was one of the most unconventional monarchs of the 17th century. She was highly intelligent, a passionate scholar, a brilliant linguist, and a patron of the arts and sciences. She was also deeply uninterested in the traditional roles of a queen. She refused to marry, and she ultimately gave up her throne. Her court in Stockholm became a center of learning, earning her the nickname the Minerva of the North. Minerva was the Roman goddess of wisdom, and the name was a tribute to Christina's formidable intellect. Christina was born in 1626, the daughter of the great warrior king Gustavus Adolphus. He adored his daughter and insisted that she be given the education of a prince, not a princess. When he was killed in battle in 1632, Christina became queen at the age of 6. A regency council, led by the brilliant chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, ruled in her name. She grew up to be a remarkable young woman. She was a passionate student, often studying for 12 hours a day. She mastered at least 7 languages. She was fascinated by philosophy, theology, mathematics, and alchemy. She began to correspond with the leading intellectuals of Europe. She famously invited the French philosopher René Descartes to Stockholm to be her personal tutor. The cold Swedish winters and early morning lessons were too much for him. He caught pneumonia and died in 1650. When Christina came of age in 1644, she took full control of the government. She was involved in the negotiations that ended the 30 Years' War with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. But her real passion was not for politics or administration, it was for culture and learning. She spent lavishly on books, manuscripts, paintings, and sculptures. She invited foreign artists, musicians, and scholars to her court. She turned Stockholm from a provincial backwater into a vibrant cultural capital, the Athens of the North. But there were problems. Her extravagant spending was draining the state treasury, and she steadfastly refused to marry. The council and the parliament begged her to choose a husband and provide an heir to secure the Vasa dynasty. Christina would not hear of it. She had a deep aversion to marriage. She once said, "I could not bear to be used by a man as a peasant uses his field." In 1649, to solve the succession crisis, she had her cousin Charles Gustav officially named as her heir. Behind the scenes, a more profound change was taking place. Christina, the queen of a fiercely Lutheran Protestant nation, was secretly becoming interested in Catholicism. It was a forbidden faith in Sweden, right? For the queen to even consider it was treason. She began to have secret meetings with Jesuit priests. The intellectual and historical traditions of the Catholic Church appealed to her. By the early 1650s, Christina had made 2 shocking decisions. She was tired of being a queen. The duties of state bored her. She wanted to be free to pursue her intellectual and spiritual interests. In 1654, at the age of 27, she did something almost unheard of. She abdicated the throne. In a formal ceremony, she renounced her crown, which then passed to her cousin, King Charles X. Gustav. She then left Sweden for good. She traveled through Europe, eventually settling in Rome. There, in 1655, she publicly converted to Catholicism. It was a sensation throughout Europe. The Pope welcomed her with great ceremony. She became a major figure in the cultural life of Rome, establishing an academy and patronizing artists and composers like Bernini and Scarlatti. She lived the rest of her life as a free woman. She was no longer a queen, but she still acted like one. She was involved in political schemes at one point, trying to become the Queen of Naples. She was a complex, often difficult, and always fascinating character. She dressed in men's clothing, had intense friendships with both men and women, and defied every convention of her time. She died in Rome in 1689 and was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, one of only a handful of women to be given that honor. The nickname, the Minerva of the North, captures the essence of her early reign. It celebrates her as a queen of intellect and culture, but her story is much more than that. She was a woman who valued her own mind and her own freedom above a crown. She was willing to give up everything to her country, her throne, her faith, to live life on her own terms. She was a true original, a queen who refused to be defined by anyone but herself. Number 3, was this queen a tyrant or a patriot? Rana Valona I of Madagascar is one of the most controversial figures in African history. She ruled the island nation for 33 years, from 1828 to 1861. To the Europeans of the time, she was a monster, a bloodthirsty tyrant. They gave her nicknames like the Mad Queen of Madagascar and the Female Caligula. But to many of her own people, she was a powerful defender of Malagasy sovereignty, a patriot who fiercely resisted the encroachment of European colonialism. The truth lies somewhere in the complex and often brutal reality of her reign. Rana Valona was not born into the direct line of succession. She was one of the wives of King Radama. Radama had been a modernizing king. He had welcomed European missionaries and advisors. He had opened Madagascar to foreign trade and influence. He had established schools and started to build a modern army. When Radama died in 1828, there was a power struggle. According to the old customs, the throne should have passed to his nephew. But Rana Valona, with the backing of a conservative faction of nobles and army officers, staged a coup. She claimed that Radama had named her as his successor on his deathbed. She systematically eliminated all other potential claimants to the throne, including the young nephew and his mother. She secured her power and was crowned Queen Rana Valona. From the very beginning, her policy was a complete reversal of her husband's. She was deeply suspicious of the foreigners in her kingdom. She saw their influence as a threat to traditional Malagasy culture, religion, and, most importantly, her own authority. She was determined to purge the kingdom of foreign influence and make Madagascar self-sufficient. One of her first major acts was against the Christian missionaries. Christianity had been spreading rapidly under Radama. Rana Valona saw it as a new religion that encouraged people to abandon the ways of their ancestors and give their loyalty to a foreign god. In 1835, she banned the practice of Christianity. Malagasy Christians were ordered to recant their faith. Those who refused were persecuted. They faced punishments ranging from heavy fines and forced labor to death. This persecution of Christians was one of the main reasons for her terrible reputation in Europe. She also broke off trade and diplomatic ties with Britain and France. She expelled most foreigners from the island. She wanted Madagascar to be able to produce everything it needed on its own. This led to a remarkable, if difficult, period of indigenous industrialization. Under the leadership of a Frenchman named Jean Laborde, who had shipwrecked on the island and gained the Queen's favor, Madagascar began to produce its own soap, cloth, guns, and even cannons. To achieve her goals, Rana Valona relied on a system of forced labor known as Fanapuana, right? All subjects were required to work for the state for a certain period of time without pay. This labor was used to build her armies, construct her palaces, and work in the new factories. It was a harsh system that caused great suffering for the common people. She maintained her power through a combination of a large, disciplined army and a system of justice based on traditional practices. One of the most famous of these was the Tangina ordeal. If a person was accused of a crime, they were forced to swallow a poison from the nut of the Tangina tree. If they vomited up the poison and survived, they were declared innocent. If they died, they were guilty. Thousands of people are estimated to have died from this ordeal during her reign. In 1845, a combined British and French naval force tried to attack the port of Tamatave to force Rana Valona to reopen trade. The Malagasy army, using their modern cannons, fought them off. It was a major victory for the Queen. The heads of the fallen European soldiers were displayed on poles as a warning. Rana Valona's reign was long and harsh. It is impossible to know exactly how many people died as a result of her policies through persecution, forced labor, and the Tangina ordeal. Some estimates are in the hundreds of thousands. When she died in 1861, she was succeeded by her son Radama II, who immediately reversed all of her policies and reopened the country to Europe. This ultimately led to the French conquest of Madagascar in the 1890s. So, was she a mad tyrant or a patriot? The European nicknames for her are clearly propaganda designed to justify their own imperial ambitions. She was not mad. She was a shrewd and ruthless politician who used every tool at her disposal to maintain her power and the independence of her kingdom. Her methods were brutal, even by the standards of her own time, but she was also successful. For 33 years, she held off the growing tide of European colonialism, something few other rulers in Africa or Asia were able to do. Her legacy remains a subject of debate, a powerful and troubling story of resistance and repression. Number 2, what's the story behind Bloody Mary? Mary was the first Queen Regnant of England. She was the daughter of the famous Henry V and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She ruled for only 5 years, from 1553 to 1558. Yet in that short time, she earned one of the most infamous nicknames in English history, Bloody Mary. The name conjures up images of a cruel and merciless tyrant, but the story behind the nickname is one of personal tragedy, deep religious conviction, and a failed attempt to turn back the tide of history. Mary's early life was happy. She was a beloved princess, the adored only child of the king and queen. She was well educated and considered the heir to the throne, but her world fell apart when her father decided he wanted to divorce her mother to marry Anne Boleyn. When the Pope refused to grant the divorce, Henry V broke away from the Roman Catholic Church and established the Church of England. This had devastating consequences for Mary. Her parents' marriage was declared invalid, she was declared illegitimate, and removed from the line of succession. She was separated from her mother, whom she would never see again. She was forced to serve as a lady in waiting to her new half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. She was a teenager who lost her title, her status, and her mother, all at once. Through all of this humiliation, she clung fiercely to one thing, her Catholic faith. It was the religion of her mother, and she believed the one true faith. After her father's death, her younger half-brother, the devoutly Protestant Edward VI, became king. During his reign, England became even more Protestant. Mary was pressured to abandon her faith, but she refused. When Edward died young, he tried to write both Mary and Elizabeth out of the succession in favor of his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. But the people of England rallied to Mary's side. They saw her as the rightful heir. After just 9 days, the 9 days queen, Lady Jane Grey, was deposed, and Mary rode into London in triumph to claim her throne. Her main goal as queen was simple: to return England to the Catholic Church. She believed this was her sacred duty, the reason God had put her on the throne. She reversed all of the Protestant reforms of her brother and father. She restored the authority of the Pope over the English Church. At first, her policies were relatively moderate, but she soon faced opposition. There were plots and rebellions against her, fueled by anti-Catholic sentiment and fear of her marriage to Philip II of Spain, a powerful Catholic monarch. Mary and her advisors came to believe that they had to take stronger action against the heretics who refused to accept the return to Catholicism. In 1555, the government revived the old heresy laws. These laws made it a crime, punishable by death, to hold Protestant beliefs. A series of religious persecutions began. Over the next 3.5 years, nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake. The victims were men and women from all walks of life. The most famous were high-ranking churchmen like Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and Bishops Latimer and Ridley. But most were ordinary people who refused to renounce their faith. The public burnings were meant to be a terrifying warning to others, but they often had the opposite effect. The bravery of the martyrs inspired admiration and sympathy. An English Protestant writer named John Foxy later documented these stories in his famous Book of Martyrs, which became one of the most widely read books in England for centuries. It was this book, more than anything else, that cemented Mary's image as Bloody Mary. It is important to put Mary's actions in context. The 16th century was a brutal and intolerant age. Rulers all over Europe, both Catholic and Protestant, persecuted people for their religious beliefs. By the standards of the time, the number of people executed under Mary was not exceptionally high. Her father, Henry V, had executed thousands. Her half-sister, Elizabeth I, would also execute Catholics during her reign. So why did the nickname stick to Mary? Part of it was timing. She was on the losing side of history. England did not remain Catholic. After her death, Elizabeth I came to the throne and firmly established Protestantism as the national religion. The history of Mary's reign was written by the Protestant victors. John Foxe's book created a powerful piece of propaganda that shaped English identity for generations. Mary's personal life was also tragic. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was unpopular and produced no children. She had 2 phantom pregnancies where she believed she was pregnant but was not. This was a source of personal humiliation and a political disaster, as it meant she would have no Catholic heir. She died in 1558, a lonely and disappointed woman. She had failed in her great mission. She had tried to save her people's souls by force, but all she had done was create a legacy of bitterness and a terrible nickname. Bloody Mary is a caricature. It ignores the personal tragedies that shaped her and the sincere, if misguided, religious faith that motivated her. But it is a powerful reminder of how a monarch's legacy can be defined by a single brutal policy. Number 1, what does it take for a queen to be the Great? There are many kings in history who are called the Great. Alfred the Great, Peter the Great, Frederick the Great. But there are very few queens who are given that title. Catherine the Great of Russia is the most famous. The nickname is a recognition of her immense political achievements. But it is also a reflection of the sheer force of her personality, her ambition, and her will to power, which allowed her to rule a vast empire for more than 3 decades. The story of Catherine's rise to power is itself a testament to her greatness. As a minor German princess brought to Russia to be a wife, the odds were stacked against her. But she outmaneuvered her husband and his court, seized the throne in a coup, and became one of the most powerful rulers on earth. Her reign was defined by 3 main areas: territorial expansion, domestic reform, and a brilliant engagement with the cultural and intellectual trends of her time. In foreign policy, Catherine was spectacularly successful. She had a clear vision of Russia's strategic interests. Her main goals were to gain access to the Black Sea and to expand Russian influence in Eastern Europe. She achieved both. In 2 wars against the Ottoman Empire, her armies won decisive victories. The treaties that followed gave Russia a vast stretch of coastline along the Black Sea, including the strategically important Crimean Peninsula. She founded new cities in the south, like Odessa and Sevastopol, which became major ports and naval bases. For the first time, Russia was a major naval power in the south. Her other great foreign policy achievement was the dismemberment of Poland. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a large but weak state. Catherine, along with the rulers of Prussia and Austria, took advantage of its internal divisions. In a series of 3 partitions in 1772, 1793, and 1795, they carved up Poland among themselves. By the end of her reign, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent state. These acquisitions brought millions of new subjects and huge amounts of territory into the Russian Empire. Catherine had expanded her empire by some 200,000 square miles. At home, Catherine saw herself as an enlightened monarch. She was a great admirer of the French Enlightenment. She corresponded with Voltaire for years, calling him her teacher. She was a patron of art, literature, and science. She founded the first state-financed school for girls in Europe, the Smolny Institute. She oversaw a reform of provincial government, creating a more rational and effective system of local administration. But her enlightenment had its limits. The Pugachev Rebellion of the 1770s, a massive peasant uprising, deeply frightened her. It showed her how fragile the social order was. After the rebellion was crushed, she dropped any serious plans for social reform, especially anything to do with freeing the serfs. In fact, her reign is often seen as the golden age of the Russian nobility. She gave them more power and privileges than they had ever had before, including more control over their serfs. Serfdom actually became more entrenched under her rule. This is the great contradiction of her reign, a monarch who read and admired the liberal philosophers of the West, but who presided over a society based on human bondage. The nickname the Great was not something that was only given to her by later historians. It was a title she cultivated herself. She understood the importance of public image. She had her victories celebrated in epic poems and grand paintings. She carefully crafted her public letters and memoirs. She wanted to be seen as a great philosopher queen, a worthy successor to Peter the Great. She was also a woman of immense personal charisma and energy. She worked tirelessly, rising early every morning to deal with state papers. She was known for her series of lovers, whom she chose herself and often promoted to high office. This has been the source of much gossip and scandal, but it also shows a woman who was in complete control of her own life, both personal and political. So what does it take for a queen to be called the Great? In Catherine's case, it took a combination of ruthless ambition, political genius, military success, and a brilliant understanding of public relations. It meant seizing a throne, expanding an empire, and leaving her country much larger and more powerful than she found it. The title ignores the darker aspects of her reign, the destruction of Poland, the suffering of the serfs. But it recognizes her as a ruler of immense historical importance, a woman who, against all odds, forged her own destiny and that of a vast empire.